Hi there, I'm Dr. Mark John Bohr. I'm a social scientist. My thesis was in the decline of religion in Western society, but today I'm here to talk to you about a book that I love. It's a book that has changed my understanding of race theory. We have here the Racism Handbook for people classified as black. The narrative of the book is Deconstructing European race theory, modern European race theory. It's deconstructed so much, not just modern race theory, but it's deconstructed so many other aspects of the discrimination of black people. And we're here to get an understanding of Howard Dean Johnson as to his writing of the book and why he's written it. What is race?
Well, race is a project of colonial rule. It's a tool of European domination of the globe. We can see it in terms of the global north against the global south racially, but it's also a description of an enduring identity. We speak of my race and your race, and we don't necessarily see it in negative terms. But largely, race is a project of a colonial domination.
I noticed in your book you were breaking that down. You gave a good understanding of that modern day race theory and how it was in a way dominated by political ideologies and ideology around trying to control. Can you explain that further?
Yes, well, these methods of control begin in the early 17th century. We have the biologist Francis Bernier. He tries to categorize races. It's a very broad categorization, and it's not necessarily hierarchical. So that really is the early stages of kind of developing a theory. It's by no means a developed theory, these early categorizations. They're not developed theories of race, but they're early forms of categorizing humans into groups, which is not necessarily a negative thing until you put them in a hierarchy.
Okay, so when did the hierarchy come in?
It wasn't until early 19th century, actually, with a philosopher called Frederick Blumenbach. He was the first to take a categorization of so-called races from a geographical method to a hierarchical one. So therefore, he tried to justify why Europeans should be at the top. So that's quite significant, because before we just had categorizations geographically speaking, but now Blumenbach begins to say, no, there's a reason why I need to put the Europeans at the top. So he begins to categorize so-called races in terms of a hierarchy. So his category was saying, well, Europeans are at the top, and this is scientific, you see? And that was one of the significant developments of race theory, because just categorizing races doesn't necessarily mean it's a full developed theory. But when you begin to justify it in scientific terms, that's when the category becomes a hierarchy, and then you can use that hierarchy to justify domination, expropriation of people's lands, and so forth.
Thank you, Howard, on that information about race categories and also the hierarchy of race theory. Can you tell us about Charles Darwin and his research into the survival of the fittest and the effects of that based on race?
I'm glad you've mentioned Charles Darwin, because in my book I have a whole chapter on Darwin called Darwin on Race. And Darwin is very significant when it comes to race theory. As I touched on earlier, what's important to understand about Darwin is that he had a category of race, but not only did he have a category of race, but he had a race theory, insofar as for him, races were scientifically in a hierarchy. Now, when you put races scientifically in a hierarchy, that's a whole new ball game. Now, Darwin, that phrase you mentioned earlier, survival of the fittest, that was actually from Herbert Spencer. That was one of his disciples, so to speak, who coined that term, the survival of the fittest, which is fundamentally similar to Darwin's phrase, but Darwin's phrase was struggle for existence. And fundamentally, the race element in Darwin's idea of the races is that he fundamentally believed in lower and higher races. And he believed that the higher races were Europeans and the lowest races were Africans. That's what he believed. And as I said, he felt that he had scientific reasons for that. And so he postulated in many of his writings, two significantly, his first book and his third book, The Descent of Man, the European race, by natural selection and natural evolutionary development, would exterminate the lower races. So in this respect, we can see that it's quite devastating in terms of its outreach, what it actually means for other races on this planet. I mean, even if you just look at Darwin's book, the title of his book is often overlooked: The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of the Favoured Races in Their Struggle for Life. Now just look at that, the preservation of the favoured races in their struggle for life. So Darwin believed that a bloody battle existed in nature, whereby certain organisms, animal, plants or insects, those that developed the right mental acuity or the physical features, they would be able to triumph over their competitors. And in doing so, extermination would be the natural cause, the natural way of society, the natural way of development. And therefore the lower races were destined to be exterminated. So in that sense, Darwin really did reinforce scientific racism. In fact, as I claim in my book and give the evidence, Darwin is part of the development of scientific racism, along with Immanuel Kant, who had a very full developed theory of race, and social Darwinism, which bears his name.
I found that really interesting and disturbing at the same time, that these academics had this metanarrative of hierarchical race theory, and you're saying that this understanding was paramount not just amongst academics but globally. This meta-narrative was going on about race theory and those who were higher in that hierarchical system of race. How do you see that impacting the world today?
As I said earlier, once the categories of race then developed into fully developed race theory, Immanuel Kant had a fully developed theory of race. Now, this is unlike Francis Bernier just making broad statements about categorization. It's even unlike Frederick Blumenbach, who hierarchized race. Here, Kant goes into notions of colour, and he actually believes that endemic in colour itself are notions of inferiority and superiority. So now this theory, this fully developed race theory, that, as I said, began in the 17th century, fully developed by the 19th century, then is then used as a justification for expropriation of people's lands, slavery, colonialism, which has now left the world in racialized distributions of power and resources. So that even today, people classified as black, people of African descent, and we call this the legacies of colonialism. We don't deny it or disavow it, we look honestly at it because we know exactly where it comes from. I hope that I've made the connection there between Darwin, Kant's theory, and of course there was the development of social Darwinism. You mentioned earlier that phrase, survival of the fittest. That comes, as I said earlier, from Herbert Spencer. And he believed, if we go a little bit into social Darwinism, he believed that it was basically taking Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest in a capitalist system. So in that sense, it was survival of the fittest in social context. You see, so it had a direct connection to laissez-faire capitalism. It had an intense glorification of capitalistic gains in a Victorian setting. That's certainly where the area that Darwin was a part of that. So I hope that helps.
It does help a lot. Thank you, Howard, for those answers. It gives a lot of clarity around what you've written in the book, around what Immanuel Kant, Darwin has written, what they've researched scientifically, and many other academics you've mentioned. As I say, it's disappointing to hear this information simply because a lot of this becomes this meta-narrative of racism. What point did it turn from race to racism?
I'm glad you've asked me that question, because here we have a language issue as well. Remember earlier when you asked me what was race, I said that it was a project of colonial domination, but only the term, it was called race, you see. So you're asking me now, at what point does the language perhaps change as well? Well, the race that became fully developed by the 19th century is racism. It's not yet called racism until the mid-19th century. So let me give you an example. There was a geologist, and I think he was a physician as well, called Magnus Hirschfeld. Now, during the atrocities of Nazi Germany, he was expelled and his institution was destroyed. And during that period, he wanted to make sense of the Nazis' atrocities. So he wrote a book called Erasmus. And when you translate that, you get the word racism. So that was the first time that it was used in academic circles. Wow. You see, he wrote a book called Racism. So then it was used a lot in the German academies and the British academies. So what we have then is the word race developing into the word racism. That's why it's called a project of colonial domination. So now the atrocities of Nazi Germany makes evident the term racism. You see, it's not an African word, racism. It's a European word, and it becomes evident after the atrocities of Nazi Germany.
It wasn't that long ago, was it?
No, not really. Absolutely not long ago. And if you get a chance to read Magnus Hirschfeld's book, it's a diatribe against many of the theories of race that we mentioned. I mean, I specifically mentioned Kant, but there were others who wrote similar theory on race. I suppose you would have to say, from a European perspective, that he would be one of the early white European anti-racists, him along with Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, who were cultural anthropologists. So
Margaret Mead?
Yes, I would say so, because obviously they were anti-racist insofar as they said that all cultures are equal. Okay. And Magnus Hirschfeld comes in that group really, although his focus was largely on Nazi Germany, because he wanted to make sense of why Hitler wanted to colonize the whole of Europe with this race theory. So he bunks all of it in that book, and that's when we get the academies and the world at large, certainly the Western world at large, and it spreads right across the world. We now have this term racism, which develops from the theory and the word race.
So having said all that, Howard, how do you define racism today?
Well, like I said earlier, because these developed categories and theories become fully developed theory, they are then used as a justification for slavery, colonization, forced migration, expropriation of other people's lands. So what we have is racialized distributions of power today that come directly out of empire. So I would say, if you're going to give a definition of racism today, I would say racism today is a global interconnected system of oppression and disadvantage based on race. You see, and when I say it's global, in that, yes, in France there's obviously racism, as there is in Brazil and the US, but they're going to be different in their approach, but they're both based on race. So we can also say racism as a system. We can also say systems of racism. The racism in France is different from the racism in the UK. Slightly different, but both based on race. So that, in that sense, they are systems of racism. How are they interconnected? Like I just said, because they're based on race, but there are various systems of racism. But largely we have to say, if we're going to be honest and study empirically, racism is now a global interconnected system of oppression and disadvantage.
So you're deconstructing race theory and deconstructing the ideologies around these academics that were racist. This global meta-narrative on race and the hierarchies of race. You're dealing with that in your handbook. How can we learn from that today?
I think it's really important that we understand why we have racism in society today. I think the tendency, certainly here in the UK, is to deny and disavow racism. Some people get literally upset when black people keep talking about race as if empire is gone. Empire is very much still with us through the legacies. And like I said, it's left us with racialized distributions of resources so that some people get more stuff than others economically. And then of course there's just racial inequality right across the board. Housing, education, income, employment, unemployment, and most significantly the criminal justice system we've seen with the atrocities in terms of Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, Howard, for that answer. Given a lot of clarity around racism, the global metanarrative that's going on even in the world today. And that leads to my next question. What is racialisation?
Well, earlier I mentioned that we are now living through the legacies of racism. One of these legacies of racism is racialisation. This is the process of imputing racial meaning to a person through race. You see? So it's imputing racial meaning to people, situations and things. So for example, language is an important part of racialisation. So you might think, I'm sitting here, I'm a person of colour. I'm an African or a person of African descent. Why would I be a person of colour? Why must I focus on my colour? Now, if I'm a person of colour, that means that Europeans, elite Europeans and Europeans in general, are supposedly, with their perceived colour, the norm, and the rest of humanity is a person of colour. That's directly out of race theory. So that's a process of racialisation. Racialisation uses racialised terms, of which person of colour is one, even though some of us think that it's a kind of term that binds us together. It still has its roots in race language. So we need to think carefully about that. So racialisation, the process of imputing racial meaning to people, and certainly person of colour, other terms, because racism is colour-coded. It's not always been colour-coded. You could use blood, the soul, culture, different ways to invoke meaning that discredits the other, but certainly colour is one of the major significant aspects of race. So calling someone yellow, the Chinese are yellow, or the Native Americans are red, but the two that are difficult for us to grapple with and perhaps accept is black and white. These are also racialized terms. There are no black people per se. These are racialized terms. There are no white people per se. These are racialized terms, and this is part of racialization. And these terms, so I'm supposedly black, that represents certain things. You're supposedly white, that represents certain things. These are the processes of racialisation.
Thank you very much, Howard, for giving that answer. It gives us a good understanding of the colour code around race. I wanted to ask you, in connection with that, what is a racist?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in my book, I have various definitions. And I do have a definition for what is a racist. And I put it down to 5 things. The first is someone who believes in structural systemic racism, who supports it. If an individual supports that, and perhaps is not actively doing anything to undo it, I think is a racist. Also, in terms of thinking about race theory, the negative race theory that we've discussed quite a lot, if a person gives biological or cultural explanations for characteristics of superiority and inferiority, that's a racist. So if I think, oh, well, you're inferior because of your culture, or biologically, I don't think you're up to the game, that's racist. If we're giving explanations that relate to biology, that's a racist as well. And then the last one, children would make jokes about your colour, you see? Why would you make jokes about someone's perceived colour? And I say perceived colour. So someone who makes silly racial epithets about an African person or a person of African colour, I would say is a racist. If you keep going on about someone's colour, in a negative fashion, then you're a racist.
Go over those again.
Yeah, sure. Someone who gives biological or cultural explanations for characteristics of superiority and inferiority. Someone who thinks that the West should be ruling the rest of the world. If you think that, in other words, it's natural, the Washington Consensus is natural, the West should be running the planet and the non-whites should be benighted and under control, that's a racist too. So you've got those two. And then, of course, you've got someone who is constantly making racial epithets in terms of colour. If you believe in structural and systemic racism and you support structural and systemic racism without trying to undo it in some fashion, that's a racist too.
What is Eurocentrism, and does it relate to racism?
There's lots of language that describes the legacies of empire. And Eurocentrism, that term, was coined by the Egyptian and French political analyst Samir Amin. And he wrote a book called Eurocentrism, which was notions of nationhood, particularly European nationhood, and how European culture is perceived as a better culture, that its epistemology is the one that we should be looking to understand how our world functions and how our nations should function and so on. So yeah, Eurocentrism it's essentially the idea that the world should be seen through European eyes. So it is a form of racism, without a doubt here.
You've spoken about Eurocentrism, and I wanted to ask you a question around that in terms of racism and why do people deny racism in today's world. I also wanted to ask you your understanding of antiracism and what does that mean to you?
I think that's an important question, why people deny the existence of racism. There are many important reasons, but I tend to think that two are really important. And that is a kind of biological reason, or reason rooted in biology. And the second one, I think, is a reason rooted in economics. Let's talk about the biological one first. Coming directly out of the race theories, certainly the fully developed theories of the 19th century, we have biological racism. And this is, I suppose, an easy way to explain it is, my genes made me do it. You see? So biological racism obviously is devastating because it causes scientific racism and so on. But it's the idea that whatever we do is part of our evolutionary construction. That's what that means, really. So biological determinism is that really we're supposed to be racist. If someone's going to be racist towards you, it's just part of our natural evolutionary development. Early forms of tribal organisation, that's all it can be, or brotherhood leads to otherhood, ethnic groups lead to ethnocentricity. These are the ideas that essentially are saying that it's normal to be racist, but on the other hand we may have things in place in society to suppress it, but that it's normal. So that's one aspect of why racism persists, because people are arguing today that it's normal, it's part of our evolutionary development. If we're going to address racism in society, it's going to cost money. So my gain is your loss. So racism is seen as a zero-sum game. Any things that black people are going to get, if we address the balance of inequality, then that's going to be an economic dynamic whereby some people appear to be getting more than others. So racism is seen as a zero-sum game, and therefore people get selfish and greedy. So I think that's part of it too.
What about anti-racism, Howard?
It's important to understand that there are two significant forms of anti-racism in the Western world. There's the liberal anti-racism and there's the radical anti-racism. When I say radical, I don't mean extreme. Now, the mainstream liberal anti-racism is the idea that racism is really just about a set of beliefs, a psychological quirk, a misunderstanding that someone might have in their mind, and then we can put things in place or try and help the person to redress that balance they may have. So it's really just about seeing racism as a psychological quirk or a set of ideologies. On the other hand, the radical anti-racism has its roots in Marxism. And Marxism, I have to say, works coterminously with what was called the black radical tradition, because many of the black radicals were Marxists. So this is where you then focus on racism as being systemic and structural. And if racism is systemic and structural, then of course you've got to find ways of dismantling it. It's a way of looking at empire. It's a way of historicising racism. The liberal anti-racism would be the founders, would be Ruth Benedict, Franz Boas. These were cultural anthropologists, and they were anti-Eurocentrics.
And they were mainly anthropologists, weren't they?
Yeah.
I know a lot of their names.
Yes, of course. They focused on culture. It was an early form of anti-racism. These liberals felt that, particularly if they were looking at Nazi Germany, felt that if society was plagued by political extremists who were racist, it would undermine liberal democracy. So it was better to get the society to be less racist by using these various racial awareness programs. So, for example, in the United States, there's a kind of 4.3 billion industry on making white people aware of their racism and so on. Liberal anti-racism would focus on that. As I said, the more radical one would have its roots in Marxism, which would focus on racism as systemic and structural and coming directly from empire. And the black radical tradition is known to do that. We have many writers and activists in the black radical tradition who focused on racism as structural and systemic. So those two aspects of anti-racism have a very different background, really. One is rooted in the personality, it's just a personality. The other one's rooted in notions of structures that are systemic, that really need to be undone in society.
Howard, I wanted to ask you the question about CRT, critical race theory. And Derek Bell was a professor and also a lawyer, and he was frustrated by the civil rights movement. He went through the civil rights movement, didn't think that the civil rights movement did enough. Can you give us your understanding of this critical race theory? And can you explain what Derek Bell's disappointments were concerning the continued discrimination of African people in the Western world, predominantly America?
That's a good question. Well, you mentioned there about Derek Bell. He was the African-American Harvard law student who was the intellectual founder of critical race theory. And of course there were others during that time. It's important to look at critical race theory because there's a lot of attack going on with critical race theory, particularly from the right across, certainly in the United States and even here in the UK. Critical race theory comes out of law in the 1970s and the 80s. There's some new developments in critical race theory in the 90s as well. Civil rights was realised in terms of law. So what I mean by that is the critical race theorists would look at the way law impacted on the civil rights movement. So the issue was that really when they looked at, things such as the Voting Acts, the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the issue was that it seemed as if, as far as law was concerned, it was really a formal equality into civil rights. So in other words, they got rid of the signs, the whites only signs and so on. So critical race theory looks at how society is completely consumed by inequality. It takes a deeper look at it. Let me give you an example. In 1921 in the United States, I focus on the United States because that's where critical race theory came from. There was what was called the Tulsa Massacre, sometimes known as Black Wall Street. A whole community was massacred. A community was destroyed and wealth was stolen. Critical race theory would look at the ways in which law was implicated in that. So, for example, law saw to it that sheriffs were able to deputize citizens, even arm them so that they could run amok in society. Critical race would look at the way law would find out that the very people who were victims were incarcerated and the people who actually caused the massacre got off scot-free. So critical race would cast a more deeper look at the inequalities, rather than just getting rid of the tokenistic, overt types of racism, how law is implicated in reinforcing structures of racism in society. Critical race theory isn't about hating white people. It isn't about that. It's about looking at the structures of society and saying, look, when you take a closer look, society is reinforced by racist policies, racist laws, and so on.
Thank you, Howard. I'm finding this information, it's very challenging, and the reason it's challenging is because of a lot of the unjust things that have happened to people because of law and because of the way that a certain race has been treated in society. It does make me sad.
Unfortunately, we have a situation in society where the right are attacking critical race theory. Because as we said earlier, when you asked me that question about why is racism consistent, why does it persist, it's because some people just don't want to face the realities and the legacies of empire which we live with. Critical race theory casts a more focused lens on why society is still very unequal. And I think some people don't want to deal with that. So then they try to scapegoat people who talk about it, or try to make critical race theory out to be something that it isn't. But as I said, it comes out of law and the study of how law impacts on societies and racist structures within societies.
Thank you, Howard, for explaining CRT and also Derek Bell's frustration around the law, especially in America. In your book, you advocate for racial eliminativism, and I wanted to find out what that is, and also, can you explain it?
Yeah, racial eliminativism means to eliminate race, the race that we spoke about at the top of this interview, to eliminate it from society. It comes out of the philosophy of race in the academies today. It's something that the academies is grappling with, because it's the idea that we should eliminate terms such as race, white, black, and so on. The problem with eliminating it, then it's going to be difficult in determining notions of inequality, because we use demographics of race to help us understand how society and how wealth is distributed in society. So it's a difficult one to do, but I advocate in my book a kind of simplified version of racial eliminativism, which is, let's just get rid of the overt racial terminology that is an exact expression from the early race science, and we're still using it today. So, for example, I may have mentioned earlier, persons of colour. Well, why am I a person of colour? The reason I'm a person of colour is because apparently notions of being white are more important and everybody else has colour. So that's an overt reflection on using race terminology. Let's eliminate the obvious racial terms. So, for example, let's eliminate terms such as yellow, red, and what's more difficult, and we obviously are grappling with this, black, white. You see, let's at least acknowledge, black's going to be a very difficult one, but let's at least acknowledge that African people are classified as black. Let's at least acknowledge that whiteness is a construction. Let's at least acknowledge that people are classified as white. We're not actually walking around as black-skinned people or white-skinned people. This is a start. This is a way of at least eliminating overt race language that has its beginnings in early race science. Let's start there at least.
Thank you for that, Howard. I wanted to ask you another question. Now that the UK has a new government, can I ask how important you think electoral politics is to black people in general?
Electoral politics for black people in the UK and in the United States has always been a tricky thing for black people. Certainly in the United States, at least I think it's a third of black people that are eligible to vote. Only about 15% actually do. And here in the UK, we had a report, the 2002 Electoral Commission report shows that among non-whites, Indians vote quite significantly. Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, some do not vote, and certainly black people, lots of black people don't vote, totally disenfranchised from voting. I think with its connection to racism, it's quite fundamental really for me. There are a lot of people in politics who are racist, and yet I see all the time black people voting for racist people. If you're a racist, you're morally questionable as a person. And also it's a big problem because you're empowering a racist who then has the ability to impose racist policies. Time and time again we see black people voting for a racist. So for example, Donald Trump is clearly a racist, but yet in the last term there were thousands of black people voting for him, and no doubt in November people will vote for him again. He'll probably be president, but black people will vote for a racist. Here in the UK, Boris Johnson, a racist, certainly said racist things, and yet black people voted for him. Nigel Farage, racist, black people voted for him, and so on. Keir Starmer, racist, black people voted. So I think it's quite fundamental for black people. Stop voting for racist people. Racist people have the ability, if they're in power, to enact racist policies. I think that's a first start. It would be great to see black people not voting for racist people.
Howard, how is this book anti-racist, and why should people read the book?
Well, it is an anti-racist book. It's also, I call it a guide. It's a black studies book, so you could use it in that respect. But its outlook is liberation from racism. It's an anti-racist book because it reminds people of the legacies of empire that we're living through and how to draw together as a community which will help us fight racial oppression, so that we can change our status, not just in this country, but around the world. It's clearly an anti-racist book because its focus is on the suppression of racism. How can we fight it? How can we continue the struggle for true racial equality for black people in this country and the United States?
Thank you, Howard, for everything you explained about your book today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you more in the future.